The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dry, cracked land. The wind stirred the dust on the ground, swirling it around the small cabin that sat in the middle of nowhere. It was a lonely place, isolated from the rest of the world. The cabin had seen better days. Its wooden walls were weathered, and its roof had started to sag under the weight of the years. It looked as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Yet inside there was a woman. She was sitting on a dusty chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Her clothes were worn and her face was tired, showing the signs of a life that had not been easy. Her eyes, however, were sharp and full of a quiet strength that had carried her through many hardships. She had lived through things that most people couldn't even imagine. And now she was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. The sound of hooves hitting the dirt broke the silence, and her head snapped up. She recognized the sound immediately. There was only one person who would be riding through this desolate land, and she knew he was coming for her. The man she had heard so much about, the man with a reputation as cold and deadly as the desert itself. She didn't move from her seat. She didn't even try to hide or escape. What was the point? She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She had been living like this for too long, always running, always hiding from the consequences of her actions. But now there was no more running. The door creaked open slowly, and in stepped the cowboy. He was tall, his broad shoulders hunched slightly from years of hard work and even harder living. His face was rough, covered in a few days' worth of stubble. His eyes, though, were the most striking feature about him. They were dark, intense, and full of things that she didn't understand. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her very soul with that gaze. She couldn't tell what he saw, but it didn't matter. It was too late for her. His hand went to the gun at his side, fingers brushing the handle, and she tensed instinctively. But she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to show fear. She had to stand her ground now, as she always had. "I didn't expect you to be waiting for me," he said, his voice deep, low, and rough, like the gravel in his boots. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I knew you'd come," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, just make it quick." There was a pause, and for a moment they just stood there, staring at each other. The cowboy's hand remained on the gun, but his posture had changed. He was no longer tense, no longer ready to pull the trigger. Instead, he just stood there, looking at her as if trying to figure out something. The woman didn't understand. She had been prepared for this moment her whole life. She had expected it to end like this, with him walking in, gun raised, and her falling to the floor. Lifeless. It was a fitting end, one she deserved after everything she had done. But here he was, standing there, not moving. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice softer now, though still tinged with a certain finality. She shook her head, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "It's too late for that. I've made my choices. There's nothing left." The cowboy looked down at her, his eyes filled with a kind of sadness, but he didn't speak. She had never been good at reading people, especially men like him. He was a stranger to her, just like everyone else had been. She had learned long ago not to trust anyone, not to get close to anyone. People left. People betrayed. She had seen too much of that in her life, but this cowboy, there was something different about him. He wasn't like the others. There was no anger in his eyes, no excitement in his movements. Just a kind of quiet resolve. The silence between them stretched on, and the woman began to feel uneasy. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to be dead by now. But instead of the gunshot she expected, there was a sudden movement. The cowboy lowered his gun, slowly and carefully. His fingers loosened from the trigger, and for the first time he let his hand fall to his side. She blinked in confusion. What was he doing? He took a step toward her, and she instinctively stood, her heart racing in her chest. This was it. He was going to kill her slowly, make her suffer before the end. She could feel the panic rising, but she forced herself to stand firm. There was no escaping now. But instead of pulling out a knife or anything else she had imagined, the cowboy reached out his hand to her. It wasn't a hand raised to strike or to force her into anything. It was an open hand, an offer as if he were asking her to take it. "Take my hand," he said, his voice still calm, his eyes looking into hers, steady and unwavering. She stared at his hand, unsure of what to make of it. Was this some kind of trick? Was he trying to deceive her into trusting him before killing her in some other way? Her mind raced, but then a strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't fear or anger or anything she had ever felt before. It was Confusion, yes, but there was something else, a flicker of hope. Could he actually be offering her a chance to escape this life, to leave the past behind? She had never been given that kind of chance. It had always been about survival, about getting by one day at a time. But now there was a choice. She hesitated for a long time, studying his face, trying to find some hint of deceit, some hidden agenda, but there was nothing. Just a man offering a hand, offering something she never thought she would have, a way out. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms sweaty as she looked at his hand. Slowly, cautiously, she took a step toward him, then another. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as she finally reached out, her hand shaking, and placed it in his. The cowboy didn't pull her toward him or say anything more. He simply held her hand, and for the first time in a long time, the woman didn't feel alone. She didn't know where this would lead, or if it would end in disaster. But for the first time, she felt like there was a possibility of something different. And that was enough. The cowboy nodded once, his expression softening. Without another word, he turned and led her toward the door, out into the harsh light of the day. The wind kicked up again, carrying the dust with it. But the woman no longer felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but at least for now, she wasn't facing it alone. The sun beat down on the two figures as they walked side by side, the dry earth cracking beneath their boots. The wind swept across the barren land, kicking up the dust in little swirls around their feet. The cowboy led the way, his steps steady, his face shadowed by the wide brim of his hat. The woman walked beside him, unsure of what to expect next, but something in her had shifted. There was a feeling in the air, something that wasn't just the oppressive heat or the endless stretch of the desert. For the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of relief. It was like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, though she couldn't explain why. The cowboy's hand had been a simple offer, but it had felt like a lifeline. She had taken it without fully understanding what it meant. But now, as they walked together into the unknown, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. They walked for hours without saying a word, the silence between them comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. She had been ready for him to demand something from her, some explanation or some confession about her past, but he said nothing. He didn't push. He simply kept walking, occasionally glancing over his shoulder to make sure she was still there. She wondered what was going through his mind. Was he thinking about her, or was she just another face, another job to him? She had heard about men like him before, cold, distant, and ruthless. But there was something different about this one. Something in the way he looked at her. Something that told her he wasn't just going to do what was expected of him. He had lowered his gun, after all. He had chosen not to kill her. As the hours passed, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the land. The temperature dropped, and the world seemed to exhale, as if it, too, was relieved to be free of the heat. They came upon a small creek, the water running clear and cool between the rocks. The cowboy stopped for a moment, taking off his hat and wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The woman stood a few paces away, unsure of what to do. She had lived on the edge for so long that even the simplest gestures of kindness felt foreign to her. The cowboy turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since they had left the cabin. "You can rest for a while," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "We'll set up camp here for the night." She nodded, though she wasn't sure how to react. She had never been in a situation like this before, where someone was offering her safety, offering her a chance to simply be. She was used to fighting, used to running from the past. But here with this man there was no fight. No one was chasing her, no one was demanding anything. For once there was peace. The cowboy knelt by the water, dipping his hands in to scoop up some of the cool liquid. He drank, then did the same for her, offering the water to her without hesitation. She took it, surprised by the simple act of kindness, and drank deeply. For a moment, all she could think about was how refreshing the water was, how it washed away the dryness in her throat. After a few minutes, the cowboy stood and gathered some branches from the nearby trees. He set to work building a small fire, his movements efficient and practiced. The woman sat down on a large rock by the creek, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the events that had brought her here, about the life she had led before this moment. She had never expected to end up like this. She had thought that she would die alone in some forgotten place without anyone to remember her. But here she was, with a man who had been sent to kill her, and yet now, He was treating her with a kindness she hadn't known in years. "I didn't think I'd be here," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear. "I didn't think anyone would ever help me. I thought this was how it was going to end." The cowboy glanced at her as he tended to the fire. "A lot of people think that way," he said, his voice low. "They think their past will define them, that there's no way out." She looked at him, her brow furrowing. "Is that what you think? That there's no way out?" He paused for a moment, his eyes flicking to hers. Then he shook his head. "I used to think that. I used to believe that once you made your choices, once you'd done the things I've done, you couldn't come back from it, but I'm starting to wonder if that's true." She didn't know what to say to that. She was surprised by his honesty, surprised that he was opening up to her even if it was only a little. It wasn't something she was used to, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. The fire crackled as the last of the daylight faded away, leaving them in the soft glow of the campfire. The cowboy didn't speak again for a while, and neither did she. They simply sat there listening to the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant howl of a coyote. It was peaceful in a way that made her want to close her eyes and forget everything, but her past wouldn't let her. It never did. It always followed her, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. No matter how far she traveled, no matter how many people she met, she was always haunted by what she had done. "You're running from something," the cowboy said suddenly, as if he had read her mind. She didn't look at him. "Aren't we all?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he fed more branches into the fire, the flames crackling and popping in the silence. "Maybe, but not all of us have the same reasons." She felt his eyes on her again, but she didn't look up. She couldn't, not yet, maybe not ever. "I'm not going to ask you about your past," he said quietly. "But if you ever want to talk, I'll listen." The woman finally looked at him then, meeting his steady gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, no condemnation, just an openness that made her heart ache. She had never known such kindness, not in all her years of running, not in all the places she had been. For the first time she felt like maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone, but that didn't mean she was ready to share it. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention back to the fire, watching the flames dance in the cool night air. "I don't know if I can ever let go of what I've done," she whispered. The cowboy didn't say anything more. Instead, he simply sat down beside her, and together they stared into the fire, each of them lost in their own thoughts, but somehow sharing the moment in silence. The fire crackled in the night, its warm glow casting dancing shadows on the ground. The stars above were bright, scattered across the sky like diamonds, each one a distant, unreachable world. The desert was quiet now, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the dry brush and the soft sounds of the creek nearby. It was peaceful, a calm that seemed to stretch endlessly across the land. The cowboy sat close to the fire, his back to a rock, his hat tipped low over his eyes. He hadn't spoken much since they had arrived at the camp, his thoughts heavy with something he wasn't willing to share. The woman sat opposite him, her legs crossed, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames. The flickering light reflected in her eyes, giving them an almost haunted look. There was a heaviness in the air between them, something that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. She had never expected to be here, to find herself in this moment. It was strange, almost surreal. Just a few days ago, she had been convinced that her life was over, that there was no more running, no more chances. She had accepted her fate, ready to face whatever the world had in store for her. But now here she was, sitting by a fire with a man who had been sent to kill her. And yet, instead of the bullet she had expected, he had offered her his hand. She didn't know why or what had made him change his mind, but it didn't matter. The truth was, she was still trying to figure out who this man really was. She glanced at him now, the man who had saved her life. There was something in his eyes, something that made her wonder about his past, about the things he had seen and done. He wasn't like the others. She had met men like him before, rough, cold and distant. But there was something different about this one. He didn't seem to carry the same kind of darkness that most men did. There was something in him that suggested he still had a choice, a chance to change. But was he really offering her a chance? Or was he simply giving her a temporary reprieve before it all came crashing down again? She didn't know. And for now, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know. She was tired of trusting people, tired of being let down, tired of the endless cycle of disappointment and betrayal. She had learned the hard way that people didn't change. They always let you down, always left you in the end, but maybe this time would be different. The cowboy shifted slightly, his boots scraping against the dirt as he looked over at her. She could feel his gaze on her, steady and unwavering, but she didn't meet his eyes. She couldn't, not yet. Not when so many questions lingered between them, unanswered and unresolved. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low, like the hum of a distant wind. "Not like you," she frowned, glancing at him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, a slight movement of his shoulders that didn't seem to hold much weight. "You've been talking more since we started this trip. Thought you'd be tired by now, but you've been silent. Something on your mind?" She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to explain it to him, how to put into words the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that had taken hold of her. There was a part of her that wanted to trust him, to let him in, but another part that told her to stay guarded, to keep her distance. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, protecting herself from the world, and now she was supposed to just tear them down for some stranger? It didn't feel right. She wasn't sure if she could ever let go of those walls, even if she wanted to. "I've just been thinking," she said finally, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, "about everything, about what comes next." He didn't reply right away, just sat there watching the fire as the flames shifted and cracked. He seemed to be waiting for her to say more, but the words didn't come easily. "I never thought I'd be here," she continued, her eyes focusing on the flames, her mind wandering back to the past. "I never thought I'd be this person. I've made mistakes and now I have to live with them. I don't know how to fix them or if I even can." The cowboy nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "No one can fix the past," he said softly. "All you can do is decide what to do with the present." The words hung in the air between them, a simple truth that seemed to carry a weight of its own. She looked up at him then, really looked at him. There was something in his eyes, something deep that told her he understood. He wasn't just saying those words to be kind. He had lived them. He had probably made more mistakes than she could ever imagine, and yet here he was, offering her something more than just survival. "Don't let your past decide your future," he added after a moment. "We all have things we regret, things we wish we could undo. But that doesn't mean it's over. Not unless you let it be." She thought about his words, turning them over in her mind. Could it really be that simple? Could she really leave behind the things that had defined her for so long? She wasn't sure. It wasn't easy to forget the things she had done, the choices she had made, the things that had led her here, sitting by a fire in the middle of nowhere with a man who had been sent to kill her. But somehow in his presence there was a strange kind of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. "I don't know if I can just forget everything," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I don't know if I'm capable of moving on." He didn't say anything for a long time, his gaze still fixed on her as if weighing her words. Finally he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to forget. Just don't let it own you. You can't keep running from your past, but you don't have to carry it around like a weight either. You can learn to live with it." She sat in silence, the warmth of the fire seeping into her skin, the crackling of the wood filling the quiet. She didn't know what the future held or if she could ever fully accept the past. But sitting here beside this man who had once been a stranger, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a small flicker of hope. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. The cowboy stood up, stretching his legs, and turned toward the creek. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "We've got a long way to go." She nodded, not sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time the idea of moving forward didn't seem as terrifying. Maybe she could try. Maybe she could take the first step, even if it was a small one. Maybe there was something better waiting for her. Something worth fighting for. The sun rose the next morning, casting a warm orange light over the desert landscape. The air was still cool from the night, but it wouldn't be long before the heat of the day would settle in. The cowboy had already packed up his things and saddled the horses. He was standing by the fire looking down at the flickering embers as the woman approached, her footsteps quiet in the sand. She had slept lightly, her mind restless as she turned over everything in her head. The cowboy's words from the night before lingered in her thoughts. She had never known anyone who spoke with such quiet strength, someone who had been through so much yet still managed to offer a hand instead of a gun. It was strange. She didn't know if she could trust it, but for the first time in a long time she wanted to. She wanted to believe that something could change, that maybe she could change. The cowboy turned as she walked up to him, his dark eyes catching hers. There was no judgment there, no sense of superiority, just a quiet understanding. It made her feel both small and seen at the same time. She wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about everything that had happened, but she felt a strange sense of peace with him. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. "We ready?" he asked, his voice steady and calm as always. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. It was still too early, and the weight of everything was heavy on her chest. She had to focus, to take one step at a time. She had been running for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to slow down, to just exist in the moment. But now, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, she felt something different, a flicker of hope, though it was still fragile. They mounted the horses in silence, the steady rhythm of hooves echoing as they rode across the open land. The landscape stretched out before them, wide and endless, a sea of dusty earth and scattered shrubs. There was no sign of life out here, only the occasional cactus or distant rock formation. But somehow it felt peaceful. It was as though the land had been untouched by the turmoil and struggle that had defined her life. The cowboy led the way, his horse moving confidently through the terrain. The woman followed closely behind, her mind still racing. She wanted to ask him questions, to learn more about him, but she wasn't sure how to begin. Every time she opened her mouth, the words felt trapped inside, as though she couldn't quite grasp the right ones. She had lived in the shadows for so long, hiding from her past, from the choices she had made. It was easy to think of herself as a ghost, someone who didn't truly belong anywhere. But now, with the cowboy beside her, things seemed different. There was no pressure to be anyone other than herself. No expectations, no demands. Just two people riding through the desert, each carrying their own burdens but still moving forward. As they traveled, the landscape began to change. The dry, barren desert gave way to rocky hills and jagged cliffs. The air grew warmer and the sun climbed higher in the sky, but the ride was still relatively calm. They didn't speak much, but there was an understanding between them. They didn't need words to fill the silence. They both knew what the other was thinking. There was a long road ahead, and neither of them had any idea where it would lead. The woman had learned long ago not to get too attached to anyone or anything. Life was unpredictable, and the more she expected from it, the more she was disappointed. People came and went, like the wind that swept through the desert, leaving no trace behind. But with the cowboy, it felt different. She didn't know if it was because he had saved her, or if it was simply because he wasn't like the others. There was a calm in him, a quiet strength that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could breathe again. After a few hours of riding, they stopped by a small stream. The sound of running water was a welcome relief, a gentle break from the endless expanse of dry land. The cowboy dismounted and tethered the horses to a nearby tree before turning to the woman. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his tone matter of fact. "You need to drink some water." The woman nodded, grateful for the chance to rest. She dismounted as well, her legs stiff from the long ride, and walked toward the stream. The cool water was refreshing, and she cupped her hands, taking a long drink. She had been thirsty for so long, and now that the water was in her mouth, it felt like a small miracle. She sat down by the stream, letting the water flow over her hands and wrists. The cowboy sat down beside her, his eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert, always aware of the dangers that could be lurking. She noticed how he always seemed to be on guard, always ready for whatever might come their way. It was a reminder that the world they were in wasn't safe. It never had been. She looked at him then, really looked at him. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The cowboy glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment he didn't answer, as if he were trying to find the right words. Then he sighed, a long, deep breath that seemed to carry all the weight of his past with it. "I've seen enough to know what happens when people don't have a choice," he said quietly. "I've done things I'm not proud of, things I can't take back. But I'm not here to make more mistakes. I don't want to add to the pain, not if I can help it." The woman listened, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She could hear the truth in them, could feel the years of regret and loss that lay behind them. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But maybe, just maybe, they could help each other. She nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure if she understood it all. "I've never had anyone offer me help before," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never known anyone to care." The cowboy's gaze softened just slightly, and he placed a hand on the ground beside him. I care. We all need someone, even if we don't want to admit it. She didn't respond immediately, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. She had been on her own for so long that the idea of someone else caring, someone else seeing her as more than just a survivor, felt strange, almost impossible. But as she sat there beside him with the quiet flow of the stream beside them, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe there was still time for a new beginning. Maybe she didn't have to carry all of her past with her anymore. She looked up at the cowboy then, meeting his steady gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his face expressionless, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Something that made her believe, even if just for a moment, that there was still hope. The days passed, and with each one the world seemed to change around them. The landscape was always shifting. One moment it was a vast, empty desert stretching as far as the eye could see. The next they were riding through hills covered in low shrubs and the occasional cactus, the land slowly beginning to show signs of life. The air, once dry and suffocating, now held a coolness to it as the nights grew longer, and the temperature dropped with the fall of each day. Yet through all the changes in the world around them, something else was shifting within the woman, something she wasn't sure she fully understood, but something that had been set in motion the moment the cowboy had offered her his hand. She still didn't know what had truly made him change his mind that day, why he had decided not to pull the trigger and end her life. Perhaps he saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself, or maybe, like him, she was just a part of a world that hadn't given up yet. She wasn't sure, and maybe that didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was that she was alive, and she was riding beside a man who didn't treat her like a criminal or a lost cause. Instead, he treated her like someone who deserved a chance. Each day they talked more, their conversations flowing as naturally as the river that ran through the valley they had crossed the day before. The cowboy spoke little of his past, but she could see in his eyes that it was something full of regret, a past full of mistakes that would never be erased. He had done things he wasn't proud of, but he was trying to change, trying to be someone different now. As for her, she was slowly letting her guard down, letting go of the walls she had built for so long. There were still moments when the weight of her past came crashing down, when the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. But in those moments, the cowboy's presence was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. She wasn't the person she used to be, and she didn't have to keep running anymore. They made camp that evening by the edge of a small forest. The trees were sparse but thick enough to offer some shade, and the ground was softer here, not as harsh and dry as the desert they had left behind. The cowboy set to work on starting a fire, his movements precise and careful, while the woman unpacked their small supplies. There was a sense of peace in the air, a calm that made it feel like they had found a small corner of the world where time didn't matter. The fire crackled to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. The woman sat on a log nearby, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water, looking out into the growing darkness. The cowboy sat across from her, his gaze scanning the surroundings, always alert, always watching for anything that might come their way. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. The cowboy didn't look at her immediately. He was still focused on the fire, feeding the flames with small branches, but his expression softened as he responded. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice quiet. "But I've stopped worrying too much. What happens, happens, and all we can do is keep moving forward." She nodded, the truth of his words sinking in. She had spent so much of her life worrying about what would happen next, about what was coming around the corner. But maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to stop looking over her shoulder and just live in the moment. "What about you?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers now. "What's next for you?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment she was silent, her mind racing. She had never allowed herself to think about the future, had never thought there was a future worth imagining. But now, with the cowboy beside her, something had shifted. Maybe she could have a future. Maybe she could find a way to leave her past behind, to stop letting it dictate everything about her life. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice uncertain but hopeful. "Maybe I'll find a place to stay, maybe I'll stop running." The cowboy nodded, his gaze steady. "Sounds like a good start." They sat in silence for a while after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The woman found herself thinking about the life she had lived, about all the things she had done to survive, and for the first time, she didn't feel as if she was tied to that life anymore. She wasn't defined by her past mistakes. She was something more, something different. As the night wore on, the stars grew brighter above them, their cold light illuminating the sky in a way that felt almost magical. She leaned back against a tree, her eyes drifting shut for a moment as she listened to the sounds of the night. The distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush. The cowboy's voice broke the quiet again. "We'll get you where you need to go," he said, his voice firm but kind. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze across the fire. "And where's that?" "Doesn't matter," he replied with a slight grin. "Wherever you feel like going." She smiled softly, the first real smile she had given in what felt like forever. It wasn't a promise of easy answers or a life free from struggle, but it was a start, a chance to move forward, to take control of her own destiny. The fire burned low as the night deepened, and the cowboy stoked it once more, the warmth filling the air around them. They sat together in the quiet, not needing words to understand what the other was thinking. There was a bond forming between them, a connection that had started with an offer of kindness and had grown into something more, something neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. As the night wore on, and the fire flickered low, the woman felt something stir inside her. It wasn't the panic she had always known, or the fear of what would come next. It was a quiet, hopeful feeling, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Maybe the future wasn't so uncertain after all. Maybe there was more to life than just surviving. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future. She wasn't sure what it would look like yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it.